Excellent, good. Lovely to see you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and very welcome to this, I think the fifth and final talk in this sixth and final talk in this Lenten series of lectures from Colmán Ó Clabaigh, and a particular word of welcome to anyone who's joining us on the webcam as well. But it's very nice to see you all here, to see some familiar faces, that we already saw this morning at Mass for Palm Sunday here. And it's wonderful to be together as a Christian community as we stand on the cusp of the great week, when our identity as Christians, as God's holy people, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb in the paschal sacrifice of Christ's passion, death and resurrection, is forged, recalled and renewed. The liturgy of Holy Week, beginning with today's celebration of Palm Sunday or the Lord's Passion, or of the Lord's Passion, is particularly dense and rich. And what I want to do in this afternoon's presentation is to look at some of the ways people have appropriated the celebrations of Lent and Holy Week in the past, to look at some of the traditions that have emerged, not just the liturgical traditions, but also the folk traditions, because there's many ways, there's in a way how we integrate this material into our everyday life helps it to bear fruit in ways that are real and tangible. To give an example, when I was a young lad growing up in Gort in County Galway, my father, we'd go to the celebration of the Lord's Passion, but my father had this thing of planting a half a row of potatoes on Good Friday. Now, you did no other work on that day, but he planted it. Was his father had done it before him, and my grandfather down in Roscommon at the turn of the 20th century had been taught this as well. And it was this connection of death and life, that something was placed in the ground on Good Friday to unite it with the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection. So there's all of these folk customs, some of which are superstitious, but many of which preserved a real spiritual, holy insight, and some of this stuff that I want to share with you as well. Now, some of them are great fun too, so this is not going to be the sort of an exercise in misery, I hope. I should also add that I'm not a theologian or a liturgist, but I'm a historian, so that's the way that I approach these things. And much of what I'm going to share with you is from research for a book that I'm working on at the moment and have been for quite a while, on religion and society in medieval Ireland. So I'm shamelessly borrowing from the work of a lot of other scholars, and if you're interested in following up on this, I recommend the following books: Ronald Hutton's The Stations of the Sun, Eamon Duffy, The Stripping of the Altars, Nicholas Orme's recent book, a magnificent piece of work called Going to Church in Medieval England, and particularly for Irish people, Kevin Danaher, The Year in Ireland, which is a very wonderful survey of calendar customs in Ireland. So we're coming towards the end. We've entered into Passiontide. We're coming towards the end of the penitential season of Lent. And there's a sense in which the names that are given to Lent in different languages tell us something about the meaning and the spirituality of the feast. In German, it's known as Fastenzeit, which means the time of fasting. In Irish and in French, you have words that are derived from quadragesima, the Latin word for 40 days. So in Irish, it's Carish, and in French, it's Carême for Lent. So that idea of the 40-day period. And again, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, 40 is a significant number. 40 days, Christ in the desert, 40 years, the people of Israel being forged into God's holy people in the Exodus there. Lent itself, the word Lent that we use, is actually the Anglo-Saxon word for spring. And it has to do with the fact that the days are getting longer. So all of these elements are interwoven with each other there. And it was, as I said, a period of fast, a period of abstinence and almsgiving, in which people were expected to abstain from meat, poultry and dairy products. So when you're facing into 6 weeks of that, the first thing you want to do is have a party beforehand, have a major blowout. And this survives in attenuated form with us with Pancake Tuesday. But in the Middle Ages, this was a much more boisterous and lively affair, as you can see here from Peter Bruegel's battle between Carnival and Lent from 1559. And this is sort of an allegorical depiction of the celebrations in Shrove Tide, in the run-up to Lent, before the period of fasting and abstinence kicks in. So you hear in the background, you have sort of games being played, food being eaten, dances being danced. You have plates of, all the foods that you won't be able to eat during Lent piled up there, cheeses. And then you have a jousting match between the spirit of Shrove, or the spirit of Mardi Gras. A big stout man sitting on a keg of beer or wine here, supported by his merrymakers, and he's got his jousting stick there, and what's he got on it? He's got roast chickens and sausages and all the stuff that he won't be able to eat during Lent. Who is his adversary? Well, his adversary is this rather emaciated and somewhat miserable looking figure over here. This is the personification of Lent, wearing the grey garb of a penitent, and for the jousting pole that she has is a baker's board used for taking bread in and out of the oven, and 2 dried herrings on the end of it there. So behind her then, what do you see? Well, you see heading into the church, people dressed in dark clothing. Everyone over here is bright and colourful, and this is the area for merrymaking. But over here then you have people heading into the church, engaged in giving alms, in reconciling themselves with their neighbour. You see them making peace with neighbours here. And finally going into the church, and you can just see the white figure of the priest here, and he's putting ashes on people's forehead there. And that spirit of carnival, of Mardi Gras, remains with us to the present day. Various parts of the world have very vibrant traditions here. This is images from Carnevale in Venice, where they go all out for a couple of weeks in the run-up to Lent, partying, dressing in fantastic costumes, having these wonderful parades and tableaux on the various canals in Venice. And similar events take place in Rio de Janeiro, and in many of the Mediterranean and the Hispanic countries as well. It's very much part of the culture there. Of course, Carnevale. Carnival comes from the 2 words carnevale, which means farewell to meet. So that's where the idea comes from. And similarly, Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, the day that you used all this stuff up before Lent began. And we know that celebrations in Ireland were also similarly boisterous from a number of references. In 1690, a man called James Dunton, an English visitor to Ireland, expressed amazement at the large amount of meat that Irish Catholics were able to consume on Shrove Tuesday. They just sort of laid into it in a way that he couldn't get his head around there. Another feature of Shrove Tuesday was the Shrove Tuesday football match. This was a major urban feature feature of urban life in English towns and cities, to an extent that it had to be banned in the middle of the 16th century. And we know that these Shrove Tuesday football matches took place in Kilkenny, Dublin and Galway in the 16th and the 17th century. Now, when we think of rugby or football matches, we think of the pale, timid and anemic GAA matches or soccer matches that we see today. These are ones that have been sanitized to within an inch of their lives in the 19th century by the imposition of rules. Medieval football, medieval ball games were tough stuff. You know, you didn't, they were not for the faint-hearted, and everyone got involved in it. You know, it was all the men of the parish against all the men of the next parish. That included your friar and your priest and whatever. And I've come across 3 references in Ireland to deaths that occur during games like this. A hurling match in Clare Galway in 1297 and a football match in Kilkenny that involved clerics. And the only reason that they turn up in the record is because the cleric caused the death of someone. He then had to be dispensed before he could renew his priestly ministry as well. So before these games were codified, they were pretty raw events. And they still survive in parts of Europe. This is the city of Florence in Italy, and you can see all this beautiful Renaissance pageantry lined up there for a game of Calcio Fiorentino. And this claims to be the oldest ball game in the world, from which soccer and rugby allegedly derive there. So you can see they're all dressed up in all their colour and finery and whatever. But when you actually look at them playing the game, you see it's a little earthier than this. You have 2 guys squaring up to each other here. You have 2 guys down here having a go at each other. There's another fight going on in the background here, another one going on over here. The one thing I haven't been able to see in this picture is the football. So whatever else they're doing, kicking the ball around. And these are actually some of the more decent picture, the most decent picture I could find on it, because like they're just laying into each other. It's like it's more a combat sport than anything else, but it does give you a feel for that. Some of the games included were what we would now call blood sports, and which were come as a bit of a shock to our system. And now one custom was that of throwing at cocks, whereby a cock or a hen would be tethered to a post, and you take turns at throwing stones at it, and whoever killed it could take it home and eat it. And there were 2 reasons for this. You weren't going to be eating flesh meat during Lent, but also you weren't going to be eating eggs. So that meant that you had, you had to cull your poultry. You had to reduce the size of your poultry flock during during that. And similarly, for the same reason, cockfighting was another feature of the season there as well. We can say very little about the household affairs of medieval Irish society or medieval Irish residences, largely because we don't have the documentary evidence for this. For England, for a lot of the continental aristocratic houses or religious houses, you have very complete sets of household accounts that enable you to see what money was being spent on. We've only 2 from Ireland, and one of them is from the House of Augustinian Canons at Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. And this dates to the 1336 and 1338 there. But it's very interesting in that it gives you a snapshot of what the diet in an elite household would have been, and the way in which Lent impacted on this. So just to give you an idea, so this is a couple of days after the Feast of St. Scholastica on the 11th of February. Just gives you an idea of what the prior of the monastery, the superior of the monastery, lived by himself. He had his own house that ran the length of this. It's now demolished, but it was on this side of the cloister there. And he would entertain important local people. So these are his expenses for entertaining the sheriff, the sheriff's brother, and some other, basically the sheriff of Dublin and his household. In wine, 9 pence. Bear in mind, just round the corner you have Wine Tavern Street, the main place for, see there's a dub there in the front. 5 pasties of fowl baked for 9.5 pence, literally down the hill from Christchurch to the left you're into Cook Street, where all of these pies would have been. This is like Uber Eats in the 14th century. And in the same day at supper for the same, wine, 2 hens and fowl bought, half a lamb, roast beef and candles. Okay, so basically the sheriff had arrived in with his household for lunch, and they stayed eating and drinking for the afternoon, and then had to send out for more food and drink in the evening there. So obviously a good pre-Lenten bash was being had there. When it comes to Lent itself, he's obviously dining by himself in his house. He's paid a penny for roast meat. I should say a penny was the equivalent of a day's wage for a highly skilled craftsman. So this would be what you would pay. A penny a day is what a stonemason would get for carving, or a very skilled carpenter would get there. And then in the evening, he spent 3 pence on wine. That would buy him 4 to 8 pints of wine in the evening. On Ash Wednesday, we now move into the Lenten diet here. So up until this, it's roast meat, it's lamb, it's beef and so forth. We've moved into Lent, so the payments are for herrings, white fish, so that's probably cod, salmon, 18 pence for salmon. Baking the salmon costs 2 pence. Almonds and rice, ginger and mustard, and also fuel there. Now, what's really interesting about this, the almonds and rice. The almonds were used to produce almond milk. And this was the substitute that was used in elite households for dairy products, for dairy milk during Lent there. And the rice is interesting because that can tell us that they were producing a dish known as blancmange, white meat or white food, which is a rice pudding. We still have it today. We'd sort of sweeten it and use it as a dessert, but they used it as a way of making fish pie out of it. So this was Lenten fare in a fairly well-off community, or a well-fed community. Of course, it's not just about food and football. Shrove Tuesday was the day on which you went to confession. You got shrift. You were shriven, which is the Old English word for confession. To get short shrift means to get a priest who's a little snippy with you. And here you have an image, again from a Dublin manuscript from 1427, of a woman making her confession to a Dominican friar. So there's a sense in which you're also, you are preparing yourselves for the 6 weeks that will come ahead. The other Shrove Tuesday and Shrovetide was also a popular occasion for weddings, because Lent imposed restrictions on marriage and on sexual relations. Weddings were not normally celebrated in Lent, and I think some of you could probably remember that yourselves. Though this proved a little hard to enforce, and in the year 1397, the Archbishop of Armagh, who was an Englishman, found himself wandering around County Derry, and he was sort of saying, look, would you keep a grip on yourselves for at least Holy Week and the week after Easter, if you can manage it for the rest of Lent there. And he allowed them, he reduced the restrictions until, except for that fortnight there. You also had, so there was a rush to the altar in Shrovetide, in the run-up to List. And a tradition grew up in County Kerry that Lent started a week later out on the Skelligs than it did on the mainland. So people allegedly would go out to the Skelligs to get married there. Now, whether this is true or not is immaterial, because what it led to in the 18th century was the circulation of what became known as the Skellig lists. And these were lists of bachelors and spinsters in the parishes of County Kerry and County Limerick who hadn't managed to find a mate. And you circulated the list, and sometimes these lists were printed. I could be sued now for this. And if anyone, for the love of God, would marry these people in the next week, they could take themselves out to Skellig and get married. There. There was also a visual element to the asceticism here. Some of you will remember the practice of veiling the statues in churches in Passiontide in the last 2 weeks of Lent. But in fact, the medieval custom in Ireland and England was to veil the statues a week before Lent began at Sexagesima or Quinquagesima Sunday. And instead of veiling them with purple cloth, they used unbleached linen cloth, sometimes decorated with designs or stencils depicting the instruments of the Passion. And this custom is still followed in some Anglican churches in Britain. So this picture is from the Twitter account of Westminster Abbey for Ash Wednesday this year, where they're covering the high altar of the church with the Lenten veil, and eventually the whole of the sanctuary would be covered with a Lenten veil. And we know that this happened in Ireland as well. I'll be coming back to that in a second. So basically, if you are from a fairly wealthy background or from an elite background, like the Augustinian canons in Christchurch, your diet was, quite high-end, almonds and rice and olive oil and so forth. For most people, Lent was porridge with the odd herring, and that was it. Now bear in mind that this is also springtime, so even though the weather is getting better, the store of food that you had from the previous year is diminished. So Lent was a hungry time, both in reality because there wasn't food available, and then because of the impositions that the penitents or the ascetic regime imposed on it. So people began to look for ways around this, and there were some very creative ways. The casual observer looking at this 12th century illustration from Gerald of Wales' Topographica Hibernica might think that these were birds. Okay? They're not. They're actually fish. Okay? Gerald of Wales is the first to record a legend from Ireland that about the origins of the barnacle goose. Note the name, the barnacle goose. And people noted that these geese arrived and then disappeared. They didn't have the notion of migration that we have. So the belief grew up that these birds were actually fish that hatched out of barnacles. And because they were in reality shellfish, that meant you could eat them during Lent. And this practice was very, very widespread in Ireland until the 1950s. In the Diocese of Ferns, you were allowed to eat barnacle goose during Lent. So, anything to sort of stave off the dried herring. And similarly, there was the big question as to how would Irish people celebrate St. Patrick's Day if it was, as it always occurs, during the season of Lent. Well, you will be pleased to hear that our patron saint came to our assistance in this regard as well. And the legend grew up that when he was, or a legend which is recorded by a 12th century writer called Jocelyn of Furness, that his followers approached him, or his Patrick's disciples approached him and said, "Look, we can't stick the fish anymore." And what he does on the 17th of March is he takes a joint of, some say beef, some say bacon, and he plunges it into a vat of water, and he says, "Our flesh, I baptize thee, fish," and takes the joint of meat out. And on that day, it's officially fish. So you could eat flesh on St. Patrick's Day and also on the 25th of March, on Lady Day. So you had a dispensation from that. So to move then, so from Lent into Great Lent into what we're celebrating now, Passiontide. This is the image of the Palm Sunday procession in Jerusalem last year. And if any of you who are joining us for tea and coffee afterwards, there are copies of the Glenstal Chronicle in the reception area there, and it invites you to take copies or a copy with you. There's a really lovely article by our brother Justin there at the moment, who is studying in Jerusalem and the whole experience of experiencing Easter and Holy Week and Lent there. And it really does, to have the experience of celebrating the mystery of the Lord's Passion and Death and Resurrection in the Holy Land is a very wonderful one, and one that he writes very well about. So Passiontide marked the period of an intense solemnity, and the liturgy becomes lengthier and more elaborate. Those of you who are at Mass today can give testimony to that with the procession and the Lord's Passion. The Palm Sunday liturgy and procession involved the whole community and saw the congregation spilling out of the church into the churchyard of the city. And to illustrate this, I'm going to talk a bit about medieval Galway here. So this is a map of Galway that was produced in the middle of the 17th century. And those of you who are familiar with that, how many of you know Galway or been to Galway? Most people, yeah. So you'll spot St. Nicholas's Church down here, and that's the Spanish Arch over here. Okay, so that's and more or less that's where the main bridge is to the present day. So that's Quay Street going down there, and that's Shop Street, and that's Eyre Square up there. There are a couple of features on it that are noteworthy. Just to say something, the map itself, there are only 2 copies of it surviving, and it measures 8 feet by 11 feet. So it's huge. We only ever see it reproduced in scaled down model. But it was produced by a man called Henry Joyce, who was a priest from Galway living in exile in the Netherlands in the 17th century. And he was more or less able to do this from memory. So it's quite a remark. And where you can compare the buildings with what's depicted on the map, it's remarkably accurate. It's remarkably accurate. It's a real act of love of the native place. But you'll notice around on the map there are a number of crosses. There are actually 14 of them on different places around the city. And these mark the points at which various processions would stop in the course of the year. So you'd have a Corpus Christi procession. Some of you will have memories of that or will be familiar with that. It's about the only time we had a modern procession, or a procession in modern churchlands. But you'd have also had 3 what were called the rogation processions, where everyone took to the street with the clergy, invoking protection against disease, and then on the other 2 rogation days, protection for blessing on the crops of the field. And you'd gather at these sites marked by the cross for various prayers. And then here you see in the churchyard of St. Nicholas another cross, and this would have been the Palm Sunday cross, where part of the Palm Sunday liturgy would have taken place. This is the ground plan of St. Nicholas, and marking the site of where the various medieval altars would have been, all 14 of them. And it's a very large church, very broad church, because there were so many processions that took place in the course of the year. We had a procession here today. We have a procession, we'll have a few processions during Holy Week. We have a procession every Saturday in honour of the Virgin Mary. Now that's quite a large number relative to what you see in a parish church. In a church like St. Nicholas's in the Middle Ages, you'd have had over 100 processions a year. One every Sunday, one every Friday, and then one for in honour of the saint who was commemorated at the altar. But the main one was, or the main 2 were Corpus Christi and Palm Sunday. And on the Palm Sunday liturgy, and we actually have a very detailed description of what the Palm Sunday procession in Dublin was like in the 16th century, and it bears comparison with what we know went on in England at the time. The congregation would divide into two groups, and one group would go out with a group of the choristers, the choir boys from the church. One of the choir boys would be dressed as a prophet, wearing a false beard and a wig. And we have from 1518 the accounts from St. Patrick's Cathedral where they pay for the hire of the wig for the young lad. And the other procession would be at the back of it. You had the reliquary, or the clergy carrying the relics of the saints in a portable shrine called a feretry, which looked like that. So the two processions would meet each other in the churchyard, and they were each led by a cross, one of which had a figure of Christ on it, and one was a plain cross. And there'd be a symbolic jousting, and the plain cross, which was known as the Lenten cross, was defeated, it was taken away, and then the procession melded together. Now, we know that this had happened in Ireland because we have a number of these portable reliquaries, these feretries, including this one here. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is actually a replica of it, which you'll see in the National Museum in Kildare Street. And this is the 11th century shrine of St. Malachan from County Offaly. The original is kept in Boher Church in County Offaly. It was produced in Clonmacnoise sometime in the 11th century, and it was very clearly designed to be carried because you can see the rings on the corners there. If you view it end on, you can see very clearly what it was designed for. So into a receptacle like this, a reliquary like this, the relics of the saints were painted along with the Blessed Sacrament. And this then was held to represent Christ walking in procession, everyone carrying greenery, yew branches, willow branches, catkins, flowers. It was a very lively affair. And when they came to the door of the church, again the choir divided into two. And the men's voices and the boys' voices in the choir entered into a dialogue. And one of them, the thing was, O gates, lift high your head, grow higher ancient doors, let him enter, the King of glory. The men's voices sang that, and the boys' voices sang, who is he, the King of glory? He, the Lord of armies, he is the King of glory. And we actually sang that here this morning in Glenstow. Now, what happened was that the men were blocked out of the church, and each time the bishop would bang on the church door with his staff before they sang that song, as Abbot Brendan did this morning here in Glenstow. The problem was we were able to use a radio mic this morning for this. How, in a medieval cathedral like this, would you enable that dialogue to take place so that people could hear it? You did it by building a small gallery over the west door with windows that could be opened, and a small gallery where the choir boys could stand inside and sing out so that that dialogue could take place. And that's the only time in the year that this feature in St. Canice's Cathedral in Kilkenny would have been used. We know that there was one in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, but that was removed when it was restored in the 19th century. So this is the type of information or the type of evidence you have to look for if you're looking, well, what went on in these places. Once you got into the church, you realised that there was a division. The church, modern Catholic or Anglican churches now tend to be open. You can all see the altar. This wasn't the case in medieval churches. There was a big screen dividing the church into the nave for the laity and the sanctuary area for the for the clergy. And that remains the case in a lot of continental and in England, English buildings. This is Lincoln Cathedral, and this screen here is known as the choir screen or the rood screen. And it's called the rood screen because very often before the Reformation there was an above life-sized image of the crucifix standing on the rood there. These were features of life in Ireland. Some of them survive, a small number of stone examples, this one in Clontuskert in County Galway. And there's evidence for wooden ones as well. This is the St. Mary's Church in Youghal. You can see the staircase that led up to the rood gallery, the balcony that spanned the entrance into the sanctuary area there. And this wooden example was taken down in the 1790s. But it would have looked something like that. This is an English example there. So again, quite a striking piece of furniture there. It would have dominated the interior of churches. And the iconography on it concerned passion, death, the crucifixion of Christ. Here you have an example from a church in Cambridge. The actual wooden part of it has been removed, but the medieval wall painting survives, and it's the Last Judgment image. You have Christ in majesty at the top, the Virgin Mary, St. John interceding for humanity, and on Christ's left-hand side, cast into the jaws of hell, you have the damned. So that's sort of the visual imagery that you're looking at in a medieval church. It's quite striking. Now, sometimes it took the form of this structure, where the Last Judgment image would be painted on boards that fitted into the arch. And we know that that was the arrangement in Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, where the doom was painted on boards above the arch. And we know that because we have the payment for the picture being whitewashed out after the Reformation. And I'd be fairly convinced that that was the arrangement that they had in Cashel Cathedral as well. But this is from a church called Winhaston in Suffolk in England. And you can see here where the crucifix itself has been removed at a later stage, along with the image of the Virgin Mary and the image of St. John here. And similarly, you can see evidence for it in sort of features like this sort of rebate here in the arch of the church at Ardcroney in County Tipperary, into which the painted boards would have fitted. So when you came into the church on Palm Sunday, into a medieval church, you didn't see any of this. You didn't see it because it was covered with the Lenten veil. The rood, the altar area was covered. And during the singing of the Passion, as we had at Mass this morning, the three clergy would have sang the Passion. When it came to the moment when Christ died, and the line and the veil of the temple was rent asunder, a rope would be released, and the screen, the veil, would fall to the floor, revealing the crucifix for the first time in 6 weeks. And at that, everyone dropped to their knees and held their hands up in an act of adoration. Did that happen in Ireland? Yes. How do we know this? Because St. Lazarian's Cathedral in Old Loughlin in County Carlow, the ring for the rope to go through it is still in situ. And 10 days ago I was over in Holy Cross Abbey in County Tipperary, and I found two little rings, the type of thing that you'd have used for, you'd see them in old stables for tying up cattle or for horses, tethering horses. Two of those sticking out of the pillars of the crossing arch there. So I suspect there's a lot more evidence for this around the country, but people just have never looked for it. And then finally, you came to the Easter Triduum itself, the celebration of the Mass of the Lord's Supper, the Good Friday liturgy, the Easter Vigil, and then finally the Mass on Easter morning. We're familiar in the Catholic tradition with the notion of the altar of repose, a place where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved throughout the Easter Triduum from Holy Thursday onwards. This was also a feature of medieval churches, and it gave rise to an architectural form known as the Easter Sepulchre. And it was into this structure here, there would have been a wooden structure. This is recessed into the north wall of a church. This is from Youghal in County Cork. Inside in this, you have to imagine all of that brightly painted, and then the sacrament preserved in a wooden shrine within it, along with the processional cross that was used used in the church. Sometimes they were made of stone like this, or like this example here from the Franciscan Friary in Quinn in County Clare, up at the east end of the church in the northeast corner. And this became an intense period or a focus for devotion. People would spend the 3 days of the Triduum kneeling by the reserved sacrament, keeping watch with Christ in the tomb. And it would be the only time that lay people would enter into the sanctuary area of the church normally. On Good Friday then, you had the reading of the Passion, but the main emotional focus came from what was called creeping to the cross. And this is where people would put off their finery, put off their clothes, their good clothes, and they would put on a linen shift, which was always regarded as the garb of a penitent, a plain linen robe. And barefoot, they would make their way to the cross to kiss it, in the same way that the cross is venerated during the Holy or during the Good Friday liturgy to the present day. We're aware of this because this happened in Ireland from one reference from 1204, when a Norman lord called John de Courcy was taken prisoner on Good Friday by his arch enemy Hugh de Lacy. And this took place up in Downpatrick in County Down. And the reason this could happen because he was regarded as a fearsome lord who was well able to look after himself, was that he was clad in a linen shift and barefoot, and he had no weapons with him. So it was regarded as a particularly treacherous act to have undergone there. Not all of the practices were devotional or orthodox. There was a belief that the blood of a hare killed on Good Friday could be used for magical purposes. So you have all sorts of elements of folk religion and superstition creeping into this as well. Now, some of what I've presented to you is familiar. You've encountered this, some of you encountered it this morning here, some of you will encounter it in the course of the coming week. Some of it is unfamiliar. It's the practices of another generation or another culture. But all of them are, whatever way we mark the Passion, whatever way we enter into the Paschal mystery, we share the faith of these people. We share the faith that in the Lord's victory over death that is commemorated and reenacted in these days. And with them, I think we can conclude in the words that will be said when the Paschal candle is blessed at the start of the Easter Vigil. Christ yesterday and today, the beginning and the end, Alpha and Omega. All time belongs to him and every age. To him be glory and power through every age. and forever. Amen.
Amen.